Hello, I'm Jivon and welcome to the channel. If you're new, cool. If you're not, we rebranded, don't worry about it. Today, I'm posing a challenge for myself. Create a video game on my own using the Unity game engine. This, of course, is a massive undertaking, one that's probably going to take years and thousands of hours to fully complete. We've all got to start somewhere though, and this is where my game dev journey begins. Stick around to see epic fails, spectacular triumph, and who knows, maybe you'll learn something. Probably not though, to be honest. If you want to see where this project ends up, be sure to like and subscribe, and let's jump in. Before we go any further though, I should probably explain my ideas for this game. Well, I really like 3D platformers, they're just so neat. And there's a lot you can do with them, so I want to make one. I've also always loved the gravity changing mechanics in Super Mario Galaxy, and I think it would be really cool to expand on that. The most obvious way to bring something new to the table in my mind is to take what Mario Galaxy did and turn it into one continuous world instead of just disconnected levels. Imagine an open world map where you can not just go east, west, north, and south, but also up and down. I think that's got a lot of potential, so I want to get started on actually making it. The first step in anything Unity, of course, is to make a new project, so I did that. I've done a little bit of Unity game making before, but this is the first time I've touched it in about 6 months, and even back then I just made Flappy Bird, so there's going to be a bit of a learning curve here. We obviously need a player character, and probably a surface for them to stand on for testing. Next, being able to control the player would probably be a good idea, so we got started on that. And oh boy, let me tell you, I did not have fun doing this. Like I said, I was basically new to Unity at this point, so coding was gonna be a challenge. Reviewing the footage of me struggling to use even the simplest Unity functionality does at least 10 psychic damage to me per second. I had to go through like 7 tutorials just to get a basic character controller going, and at least 3 more to get it working with the camera. Huge thanks to MacMind Games, who helped me understand Unity's input system, iHeartGameDev, who made figuring out how to make a third-person camera way easier, and Vionic Studio, who helped me understand sphere casting. I'll link all of their tutorials in the description below. Anyway, now we have a semi-working, semi-decent third-person character controller that lets me move, jump, turn the camera, and it automatically changes my movement directions to match the camera. I'd say this is a decent enough first step for the project. Let's keep moving though. Okay, well the player controller definitely works, but I still have a problem. The player isn't fun to control. The movement is jerky and unrealistic, and jumping is very easy to mistime, which makes the game seem unresponsive. Testing any future mechanics with this movement would legitimately feel terrible. To fix these problems, we need to leave the realm of coding in the Unity editor to enter the world of game design. There's 4 tweaks we can make to the character controller to vastly improve how responsive and realistic the controls are. The first one is what's known as coyote time. In games, as a player walks off a ledge, they often press jump just a bit late and end up falling to their death. Even if they did technically deserve to die, it doesn't always feel that way, and the game can seem unfair. This can be fixed by adding what's known in the game design trade as coyote time, which means letting players jump for just a little while after they stop touching the ground, which gives the players a bit of wiggle room for misinput and stops any controllers from being thrown out of windows. Next up is input buffering, specifically jump buffering. As it is, if I jump, and then press the jump button again in midair, the input just gets eaten, and when I touch the ground, nothing happens. The player just stands there until jump is pressed again. This makes it really hard to chain jumps, because if the button press is a tiny bit early, the jump just doesn't happen. We can give the player a bit of leniency on this front by storing their jump input for a short while after the button gets pressed, so actions still happen even if the jump button gets pressed before the player hits the ground. This makes timing button presses a non-issue, which makes the player a lot more fun to control. The next issue we have here is related to the actual moving around instead of the jumping. As you can see here, the player movement is all jerky, with no concept of acceleration or weight, which, living in a world governed by the laws of physics the average gamer just isn't used to. This happens because the player's velocity is exactly the same as the joystick inputs, so the velocity snaps to the direction of the stick as it gets moved around. Instead of just doing that, we can pass the joystick's output through a smooth damp function. You don't need to know exactly what it does to understand it, but in general, a smooth damp function smoothly interpolates between the player's current direction of movement and the direction the joystick tells the player to go. Now the player feels like there's weight to them, and even though they're technically less responsive, the controls still feel way more intuitive this way. This last tweak isn't technically required, but I think for a platformer it makes sense, making the player jump higher when the jump button gets held longer. This doesn't actually make the controls more responsive or smooth or anything, but it does give the player more options, and it's pretty fun, so I'm keeping it. None of these changes were all that big, but added up, the movement feels so much better. We don't have a semi-decent third-person character controller anymore. I would say that this is actually a good character controller. I feel happy leaving it as it is and moving on to the next part of the project. It's finally time for the moment you've all been waiting for, the actual cool thing in the video title, Changing Gravity! Honestly, this was way harder than I thought it would be, and it's what I spent by far the most time on. My first attempt to mess with the gravity was, not good. Not only did it not actually work properly, it also had a lot of hard coding involved, which would make it very difficult for me to build an entire game around. Right when I was starting to wonder if I was a capable enough programmer to pull this off, I realized something. I'm not alone! Turns out, Mario Galaxy might have been a popular game. Who knew? And I'm far from the first person to try to recreate its main mechanic. In particular, one tutorial by Slugglove, linked in the description below and the card above, had almost exactly what I needed to make gravity changing work. I honestly wasn't as far off as I thought, but their code is way more elegant than what I had come up with. The general gist of how it works is that there are gravitational fields placed throughout the Unity scene, which rotate the player to be in line with the local direction of gravity, and also pull them in that direction. Unfortunately, while that definitely steered me in the right direction, my problems were far from over. Even in the original tutorial, there were a few visible bugs with player movement, but they were nothing compared to what I was dealing with. Here's a quick run through of all the problems I had. By the way, things are about to get kinda technical, so if you don't care about that and just want to see the cool gravity stuff, skip to this timestamp. Warning, the technical stuff is basically the rest of the video. In my original player controller, the jumping and the movement were locked to the global X, Y, and Z axis, which means that the player was always supposed to jump in the global up direction, and they were always supposed to move in the global X and Z directions, rotated to match with the camera direction. The way the character movement works is that it keeps the player's Y speed, and it sets their X and Z speed to the smoothed out joystick input from earlier. This means that movement always goes in the same direction relative to the world, but not to the gravity fields. When the player is on top of a planet, this isn't really a problem. But as soon as they try to go any further than the planet's equator, instead of following the planet's curve, the player zooms off into the distance. Apparently, when most people design character controllers, they assume that up is up and down is down. Ridiculous, I know. Why should up be up? Why can't it be sideways instead? Big gravity shouldn't have to control our lives. We should be free to fall in whatever direction we want. Anyway, this seems like it should be a simple fix. Just rotate all the movement directions to be relative to the direction of gravity instead of the world. And that is what you want to do, but that is way easier said than done. It took hours of research, watching tutorials, reading Unity forum posts from 5 years ago, and making tiny changes to the code hoping that the problem would fix itself until I finally figured it out. But once I did, everything worked basically perfectly. I'll explain my solution now. The problem I needed to solve was this. How do you get the component of a vector in any given direction? For reference, vectors are how Unity deals with most types of motion. They have 3 numbers, an X, a Y, and a Z, that can be thought of as a point in 3D space. And the vector kind of makes an arrow starting at the origin, going to that point, to figure out what magnitude and in what direction the vector needs to be. Unity has built-in ways to get the X, Y, and Z components of a vector, but I had to figure out how to do it for all the other directions. It's kind of complicated, and I'm not super sure I understand it, but what I did was get the dot product of the vector I want the component of, and the unit vector, which is a vector of size 1, in the direction of the component that I want. This basically outputs the magnitude of the first vector and the direction of the second vector, even if that's definitely not what dot products are usually for. Anyway, now that I have the magnitude of the vector, I can just multiply my unit vector from earlier by that magnitude to get my solution. It's a lot to wrap your head around, but it works, and plugging this code back into my player fixes all of the problems. The player can not only walk around the planet I made, but also jump between different planets very easily. The only quirk left now is that the camera sort of snaps to the rotation of the player, which can be disorienting. The simplest fix would be to make it so that the camera rotates slower than the player, but remember that the player's movement directions are calculated using the direction the camera is facing. If the player's up direction and the camera's up direction aren't exactly the same, things get a little... So I can't do that. What I can do though is set up a dummy camera that has all of the same properties as the original one, and use that to calculate the player's movement directions. That leaves the real camera free to be as smooth as it wants with no movement related bugs. Now everything is feeling really smooth, fluid, and honestly fun to just mess around with. All that I needed to do from here was to fix a few very small bugs with the gravity changes, and that's about it. By this point I was sick of staring at all the gray, so I grabbed some free placeholder textures off the Unity asset store and dropped them into the project to get everything looking a little more spacey and thumbnail worthy. Now here's some footage of me messing around with the little testing world I created. Enjoy! Alright, I think that's where I'm going to call it today. I went from knowing almost nothing about Unity to programming a full, smooth character controller and a gravity switching system over the course of about 3 weeks. Granted, I definitely couldn't have done it without all the amazing tutorials online, but I learned a ton, and there were still issues that I did need to fix myself. I'm very hopeful for the future of this game, and I'll definitely keep working on it, so be sure to like and subscribe if you want to see where this project goes from here. I've been Gvon, this has been as of yet unnamed space game devlog number 1, and this was never a gaming channel.